webinar, and thank you for joining us. The title of this webinar is What's Next for Sustainability? How can future trade policies promote sustainable agriculture and food production? Welcome everyone to this discussion, and I look forward to a fruitful exchange with the experts that we are lucky to have with us. And in the context of the ongoing review of the EU's trade policy, as well as the related public consultation, we would like to discuss how future trade policies can promote sustainable agriculture and food production. This discussion will also focus on their likely impacts for business in Europe and how the results of the US election might play a role. Finally, our discussion will be informed by a recent study that ECIPE published on the topic of trade and sustainability, which is titled The Role of Trade Policy in Promoting Sustainable Agriculture. For this discussion, we are joined by Mr. Jakobovic, Vice President of Copa Cogeca, Ms. Boury, Deputy Director General at DG Sante, European Commission, Mr. Weigel, Head of Unit at DG Trade, European Commission, and my name is Philipp Lamprecht. I'm a Senior Economist at ECIPE. And without much further ado, I would like to start with a quick presentation of the study that I mentioned just now. I hope you can all see my screen. So this study, just to give a brief introduction right now, covers, of course, the aspects of trade and sustainability. And we know, just to give a first introduction, that there's a long history of countries improving sustainability standards in most parts of the economy, while at the same time pursuing ambitions of rules-based international trade and economic integration in other countries. And we also can observe that usually those countries at the vanguard of sustainability also tend to be countries that are most open to trade. And this has a couple of underlying reasons, and there are some observations that we can make. Firstly, the production standards that consumers expect of the goods and services they are purchasing are increasing. And this applies particularly to food. There's been a sharp increase in consumer awareness and the preferences they have for sustainable production. So that's the first reason that we have, and also a development that we can observe. Secondly, governments are setting higher demands also for products and production processes. And these demands manifest themselves in regulations, standards, and the acknowledgement of various voluntary standardization schemes. And there's also a third observation to be made. Most governments that now negotiate and sign international trade agreements put significant emphasis on ensuring that new market access will not dilute sustainability standards. Now, what is the purpose of the ECIPE study? Why exactly did we do this study, and why did we decide to also talk about it now, of course? So the purpose is to investigate how governments with high sustainability ambitions actually approach the issue of trade and sustainability, and especially how they work with, on the one hand, specific provisions in FTAs, and then, on the other hand, development of domestic standards and their linkage to trade. So it's a connection, of course, of the domestic level with the element of trade negotiations. It looks directly at how these standards are designed and what lessons that can be learned for governments that want to raise sustainability ambitions. It also considers 9 modern FTAs and includes an analysis in detail of the so-called best practices regarding key sustainability standards and regulatory cooperation agreements internationally. We also, of course, take into account the rules at the World Trade Organization, which are a basic fundamental block. It also puts the results of the analysis, specifically in this topic area, in the context of the Norwegian ambitions to improve its sustainability standards for food placed on the Norwegian market. So that's one angle of the study where we go into more detail, of course. Finally, we consider also EU policies and how they are likely to change in the foreseeable future. This is, of course, also one of the topic areas that we look forward to discussing here with the experts. It provides a discussion of issues that are likely to remain very high on the agenda of the European Commissions to come and current. So these include possible improvements in the TSD chapters of trade agreements, in particular with regard to enforcement mechanisms, engagement of civil society, climate action. Of course, there are also topics such as carbon border tax, discussions related to due diligence of supply chains and multilateralism. So we have a lot of different topics. Some of them we can discuss today. Now I would like to briefly also go to the conclusions or observations that we could make as a result of this study. So in terms of conclusions, the report identifies 4 main observations that should inform future policy development. Firstly, regarding the Norwegian angle of our analysis, we do see a case that can be made for aligning Norwegian trade policy to EU trade policy when it comes to provisions on trade and sustainability. Secondly, as a general observation, and this is actually also important to take a step back, so to say, there is a substantial body of scientific evidence, risk assessments, and international experience of standards in areas that are related to sanitary and phytosanitary standards and to environmental standards, which any government that wants to raise sustainability standards can draw on. Thirdly, many countries do actually struggle to formulate their domestic sustainability standards in a structured way, which is key if you want to include it in international trade negotiations. This is a critical point for governments that are considering to introduce higher standards, with a consequence especially for market access for foreign producers. To avoid any confusion or accusation of standards being a disguised trade restriction, countries would have to structure and systematize its standards if ambitions were to be raised and form part of market access policy. This is another key point. A first step, thus, for a policy that seeks to condition import on the compliance with a standard is to make the standard clear and explicit. And fourth and finally, we have observed that there are direct and indirect relations between domestic standards and provisions in FTAs. So FTAs often deal with policies that cannot be directly formulated in a domestic standard, like some aspects of labor laws. They also deal with other forms of standards that need policy convergence in order to guarantee smooth trade between the contracting parties. So generally, it cannot be said that the EU or other entities use FTAs to regulate or to establish a standard. It rather happens bottom up through domestic regulations that later get reflected in trade agreements. These are some of the observations of our study. And without much further ado, also not to take too much time away from our speakers, I would like to open the discussion, as I said, in the context of both the ongoing EU trade policy review efforts, as well as in the light of the recent US election, and also given all the context that I just discussed. I invite the speakers to react to these questions, but also to update us on any other thoughts or considerations they might have regarding trade and sustainability. So the first question would be, and this is just a general discussion for all speakers, of course, what are the likely scenarios and the next steps for trade policy and sustainability internationally? Then what are the likely impacts for business in Europe? Another important question, of course, is how can EU trade policy promote sustainable agriculture and food production in the future? What do you see as the key elements, key challenges, and steps? What role also might be the results of the US election, and what role could it play for trade and sustainability in the future? And in order to start off this discussion, I would first like to invite our panelist, Mr. Jakubovic from Copa-Cogeca, to start with a presentation of up to 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lamprecht, dear Madam and Sir, Chairman. First of all, I'm honored to be a webinar of the European Center of International Political Economy. Firstly, allow me to represent shortly myself. I come from Croatia, the most northern and developed region called Varaždin. My education and primary work were in IT sectors, and now I'm representing innovative, digitalized, and precise organic farming. On 5 hectares on my own farm, We produce herbs and process organic and biodynamic cosmetics from herbs, mostly lemon balm. We joined 10 small and medium farmers, export products in 10 European and some European countries. Currently, my position is Vice President of COPA in Cogeca and President of Croatia Chamber of Agriculture. Let me also introduce shortly COPA in Cogeca. COPA in Cogeca represent 22 million farmers and their family farmers, as well as our 22,000 cooperatives that are dedicated to providing 446 million EU citizens with safe, nutritious, high quality and affordable food for every day. Over the years, the EU agriculture sectors has proven to be a strategical sector of the EU on that ensure the security. About the first question, what are the likely scenarios and next step for trade policy and sustainability? Well, from EU perspective, it's essential that we cover all the aspects of sustainability, every type, economic, environmental, and of course social. Indeed, we should establish common ground with our allies on the main lines, for instance, on food safety, sustainability, or the climate, in particular on how to integrate the Paris Climate Agreement into the trading system with clear enforcement mechanism. As a market-oriented sector, it's crucial to ensure that these sustainable production standards do not undermine the EU farmer sectors, competitiveness, or push consumer to buy cheaper non-European products. The accessibility lowers sustainability standards, resulting is a lower overall level of sustainability. Indeed, without sufficient WTO framework, the sector still faces a series of challenges. The existing high EU standards, for example, for animal welfare, should serve as a competitive advantage on international market. They should therefore gain recognition from outside the EU and increase export revenue where market are willing to pay for these EU products. Shortly about second question to what are the likely impacts of business in Europe? Well, the objective is to create added value that would translate into benefits for farmers and agri-cooperativeness. Despite the positive trade balance, EU farmers have not seen yet this translated into the real value at farm level. Furthermore, the EU framework is increasingly pushing up production cost. This is not taken into account in international trade agreements, despite EU leading rules in these areas. So we need to create some synergy between internal and external policy. It is therefore necessary to re-examine production standards under the EU trade strategy. This includes standards on animal welfare, production rule underpinning organic farming, or contribution to protecting the environmental and mitigating climate change, which are based on sufficient and transparent traceability rules. This is especially key given the development of private standards and the little progress made in multilateral negotiations. This is even more crucial considering the higher sustainability standards proposed by the and Farm to Fork strategy. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, EU farmers and agri-cooperatives have been able to maintain the supply of food to citizens. We remain committed to maintaining the steady supply of safe, high quality and nutritious food for citizens across the EU. That ensuring food security that is built on the foundation of proper foundation single market. All measures, including trade, that can safeguard and guarantee the functioning of agricultural activity and its cost and cash flow must be introduced. About the third question, how can EU trade policy promote sustainable agriculture and food production in the future? We have to develop, first of all, we have to develop a level playing field across all operation in international trade. So strong and effective rules of origin shield EU production from unfair competition. The European Commission should work on establishing a good approach to bilateral agreement that remains consistent with the change to the EU internal policy on the provision of information to consumers. EU investment on high standard and high quality of EU produce requires careful assessment on the relevant import into the EU. Given the agri-food sector's interest in exporting add-value product, the concept of reciprocity may be introduced when impacts are relevant to the EU. So, improving communication on the trade agreement condition. For example, the Commission delegation could meet with business organizations and companies to raise awareness. Second, maintaining high-level business diplomacy missions and strengthening the capacities of the EU representatives of third countries with the scope of handle market access or trade barriers issue. As SME may not be able to handle this kind of local market challenges themselves because they are too small. EU assistance would be a significant value for them. Next, addressing the need to check the benefits of trade and trade agreements in terms of farmers' income and the communicate this. Second, properly enforcing trade provisions, including SPS provisions and the protection of GI. And the last, sufficiently funding the promotion of EU agri-food products on export or third destination. And about the last question, what role might be result of US election plan? From our point of view, when exercising global leadership, we have to develop a level playing field across all operations in international trade, guaranteeing a balanced trade flow. We must promote all aspects of EU sustainability and extend the benefits of trade to farm level. Supportive of the EU current Trade for All strategy. We expect the future open strategy autonomy strategy to build the achievement of the current strategy while also including the geopolitical and sustainability changes. Our approach to the US-EU trade relations is to develop them further, of course. We see some favorable development on both sides, and we certainly want to continue this progress. Politically, a relation on both sides of the Atlantic are clear. Therefore, we are not actually lobbying for negotiation, but there is absolutely no need to destroy on mutual trade. In the past, EU farmers and agri-cooperatives support the process of the TTIP negotiation. So that will be very short, but I want to say for start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jakubovic, for these comments, and we already heard some comments also directly to the European Commission and about also EU trade policy. And of course, this is one part of our webinar to allow a discussion between the business side and also the EU side. And thank you also for your first initial comments on your suspected impact of the US election. Of course, we will discuss this in further detail in the Q&A section as well. But to directly also respond to your contribution and also to present an angle from DG Sante, I now yield the floor, so to say, to Ms. Bury to give a presentation of up to 10 minutes and also react to anything that was said before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, and good morning. It's my pleasure to be here with you to participate in this, what I hope, I'm sure is going to be a very interesting discussion about trade policy and sustainability. And I was very pleased as well, I'm very happy to see the presentation of your study, which we had also looked at, of course, when preparing for this morning. But I will answer all the questions that you set out, but I'm going to answer them in a slightly different way, if that's okay, because I want to talk about the farm to fork policy that Mladen already mentioned. And I want to say how that relates to trade policy, because I think it's kind of at the vanguard at the moment of trade policy in terms of new areas. I would also like to talk about how we intend to implement the farm to fork policy in our trade relations, what our ideas are. And Ulrich, of course, may want to respond on that because we're still discussing it with our colleagues in DG Trade at the moment. And then I would like to talk as well about what we think the impact of farm to fork is going to be. So first of all, what is farm to fork and why is it relevant to trade policy and how does it relate to trade policy? So about 6 months ago, the Commission adopted the farm to fork strategy. And the idea of the strategy is to enable the transition to a sustainable food system that does two things. One, that safeguards food security, which of course has for a long time been one of the objectives of the EU, but also secures an access to a healthy diet and contributes to the environment and the climate footprint. Obviously, the area of food systems are very important in terms of global emissions. The IPCC has said that food systems are responsible for around between 21 and 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore the strategy and its actions are a part of the Green Deal. So this is really part of the Green Deal. It's part of the way that the EU will deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So the strategy sets some concrete targets, including the following: reduction of 50% of pesticides by 2030, also 20% of use of fertilizers, 50% in use of antimicrobials used for farmed animals and agriculture, and also trying to move to have 25% of agricultural land as farmed land as organic farming. It has other ambitious measures to make sure that our EU citizens opt for the healthy option in terms of food through labelling and so on. But as I say, it's very much part of the Green Deal. And as you know, the Green Deal has been one of the priorities of this Commission from the outside, along with digital. But one of the other things that the Commission has said is that trade is not an end in itself, but it's really a powerful tool to export EU values across the world. And I think you've been saying this in a way in your study for quite some time, but the Commission articulated that in its political guidelines. So trade policy is also crucial in the realization of the Farm to Fork strategy, in particular the international ambitions. And so because we can't really move to a sustainable food system on our own, it doesn't make sense if the EU does that without discussing with the rest of the world. The Farm to Fork strategy clearly says that the EU trade policy should contribute to enhance cooperation with like-minded partners and to obtain ambitious commitments from third countries in areas like animal welfare. You mentioned that, Marlon, you talked about how much the animal welfare standards should be something that is used as a brand for EU exports and show the competitiveness of our farmers. Also, the use of pesticides, the prevention and the halt of food fraud, the reduction of food loss and waste, and the all-important fight against microbial resistance. So how would we implement the Farm to Fork's international ambitions? Of course, in the best and the traditional way, by engaging with trading partners. We would like to ensure a level playing field for EU producers, but and at the same time assure EU consumers that products imported respect the same conditions as those which apply within the EU. So we will, of course, explore the idea of regulatory convergence. And as you know, and as already has been mentioned, many bilateral agreements already include chapters on trade and sustainable development, on trade and the environment. Some already have provisions on animal welfare, antimicrobials, or biotechnology. So these can be used as a basis for further discussions on the Farm to Fork strategy. From DG Sante's perspective, and here, I mean, this is still something, as I say, we're discussing with DG Trade. We would like to expand those provisions. We would like to be more explicit about sustainability of food, because we think it goes beyond just sustainable development. Although that's a very, very broad concept, we think that it's necessary also to talk about the sustainable food system. So we want to work with international partners, both bilaterally and multilaterally, to construct what we've begun to talk about as green alliances and promote the standards for sustainable food systems at global level. Now, cooperation with global partners, and here I would mention the US, of course, is crucial in this respect. And we would want to have talks with the US to explore possible synergies between the different strategies. And of course, we hope now that the results of the elections mean that the US at high political levels, but also in the administration, will be more open to those kinds of discussions, and that we can try and see how our policies could converge. The EU is the biggest importer and exporter of agri-food products and the largest seafood market in the world. The production of commodities can have a negative environmental and social impact, as I mentioned already, but that can be the case as well, of course, in the countries where they're produced. So I think there is now a global consensus that food production leads to serious environmental concerns, and that those concerns can no longer be ignored. Of course, it's a question which remains as to how exactly you deal with those concerns, and that's what I think we need to discuss with our partners. Whether setting targets in the way that we have done it is the right way to go about it. We believe it is, because by setting objectives like that, we can then pull through into the policies. We're modifying a number of our legislative texts to be able to take account of those targets. And it's clear that whilst Farm to Fork is a strategy which doesn't have an impact assessment, every time that we come along with a specific legislative measure, it will need to have an impact assessment. And of course, we will apply the WTO test to that. I mean, Philip, you rightly reminded us of the need to do that in terms of all measures that are adopted. So we will try and make sure that they are not more trade restrictive than necessary to achieve their objectives. And we would comply fully with ordinary better regulation principles when those measures are adopted. So we're already talking to trading partners. We've already had a meeting which we had 150 participants to explain to them what it's all about and to see where we could engage with them. And we had a very positive response, with several countries coming back to us and saying that what we had said made sense to them, it struck a chord, and that they wanted to work with us. So last, I want to say a few words about what could be the impact of the Farm to Fork policies. Now, the cost of climate and environmental action may seem very high, but it's, I think, dwarfed by the cost of inaction. Because if we look at what it means in terms of biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse. These are the biggest threats that are facing humanity. So I think certainly that's what inspires the van der Leyen Commission, that we have to act on this. But we're obviously very conscious as well of what Mladen said about the fact that we have to also ensure the competitivity of our farmers and be sure that the pace of change, they are able to keep up with it, and it can be beneficial for them. But we see, for example, that there are many poor and developing countries who are very much affected by changes in climate, by erratic weather patterns, by droughts and so on. And it has a huge impact on their agriculture and food production. So we would say that sustainability is very much in the interests of the farmers. And according to the OECD, the world lost an estimated between 3.5 and 18.5 trillion per year in ecosystem services from 1997 to 2011, owing to land cover charge, and an estimated 5.5 to 10.5 trillion from land degradation. So with this, I think, shows that the foundations of our economy are threatened, and the cost of inaction are huge and anticipated to increase. So from our perspective, the transition to sustainability is not a threat for farming or retail sectors, but it's rather an economic opportunity. The transition to sustainability could represent a first mover advantage for EU business if we use it in the right way. And I think here I go back to what Mladen was saying about if businesses can make sustainability their trademark, then actually implementing the changes which are needed to secure the future of the agricultural sector, and they do that before competitors outside the EU, that can be a competitive advantage. Of course, sustainable production doesn't mean rejecting innovation. On the contrary, it means embracing research and innovation and digital technologies because they have the potential to increase the sector's sustainability and competitiveness. We can't deny, of course, that there will be some impact on certain parts of the farming sector. And for this reason, the changes will be accompanied by financial and regulatory tools. The new CAP will provide member states with the way to reward and compensate sustainable choices of farmers. They will get support from the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy through funding, through eco schemes to take up sustainable practices. I would also like to, the question has been posed, I think, how realistic are these deadlines that you've set, and how realistic are these targets that you've put for reducing the antimicrobials and reducing the pesticides? They are realistic because if we look back what's been done over the last 20 years, we were able to increase production on the agricultural side, at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the risks from pesticides between 2012 and 2017 was decreased by 20%, and antimicrobials in farming went down by 33% from 2010 to 2017. So I think this shows that the targets that we've set are realistic. So just to wrap up, I would say that trade policy is absolutely crucial in the realization of the Farm to Fork strategy, and vice versa. The Farm to Fork strategy is also now an important part, and will be an important part of trade policy. We want to work with our partners both bilaterally and internationally to construct green alliances and to promote standards for sustainable food use at global level. And the transition to sustainability is not a threat to farming or retail sectors, but it's rather an opportunity if it's embraced in the right way. So those will be my opening comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Berry, for these very comprehensive comments. And yeah, without much further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Weigel to react to both the perspectives from business as well as from Ms. Berry, with quick overview of up to 10 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here in that very important discussion. Indeed, trade and sustainable development has become a key feature of what trade policy, EU trade policy, is standing for. I think in your report you have an annex which gives a good overview of all the provisions that cover labor commitments, environmental commitments in our different agreements. And we do have come a long way in doing so, in incorporating these commitments in our bilateral agreements, starting with the Korea Free Trade Agreement. The commitments do cover and are constructed around international conventions. And I think the fundamental to impose our own standards on the rest of the world, but we want to make sure that those international reference frames that are there, like in the International Organization for Labor with the core labor conventions, or in the world of the multilateral environmental agreement, that our partners commit to the ratification of those agreements and to the effective implementation of those that have ratified. And in the case of core labor conventions, also to commit to the effective implementation of the principles of those core labor conventions if they are not yet ratified. This is an approach that pretty much links into existing conventions. And when we come to implementing these provisions, it also pretty much links into the operation of those conventions by the organizations that manage them. And there we have seen in our practice so far that implementation of labor conventions can very much rely on the good and extensive work that's being done by the ILO office and secretariat and offices all over the world. So just to highlight that specific feature, because I think when we look at what do we cover in sustainability so far in trade agreements, and what is now the discussion of topics that the Farm to Fork strategy is adding, we may discover certain features that are slightly distinguished. I would just finish on the with this general perspective on trade and sustainability provisions in the EU by recalling the hearing the European Parliament of my Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, which extensively covered sustainability and the question of what kind of commitments, the question of what kind of implementation. And it showed a strong interest both, but also a strong commitment in furthering that work with a couple of very specific avenues that we want to take further. One is to use the newly created office of the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer to make the implementation of commitments in trade agreements, and not only market access commitments, but also sustainability commitments, more systematic, more granular, as were the words that have been used. Secondly, to engage in a study on comparing how other countries and trading partners do implement their commitments, so that we can look towards best practices. Thirdly, to bring forward work that we have done 3 years ago, accomplished in 2018, in drawing up a set of priorities for work on trade and sustainable development, the so-called 15-point action plan. That is now to be brought forward to start next year. And just to say, there is a lot of attention, and the attention is increasing, and it's responding to very high interest among our stakeholder community. Part and parcel of both the identification and implementation of these elements. Now, we have seen the Farm to Fork strategy. The Farm to Fork strategy expressly refers to that ongoing work and makes it part, but it also sets out other targets as Claire has specified. These other targets in particular have these ambitions on the prevalence of pesticides in produce and their use, the question of antimicrobial resistance, and the question of animal welfare. The trade contribution to that can be already seen in what trade agreements today are doing to promote these issues. In recent agreements, we have distinct provisions, sometimes chapters, like with Mexico, on animal welfare and animal welfare cooperation. We have provisions on cooperation on antimicrobial resistance. And certainly the agreements are constructed in a way that decisions we take for the single market, things that we find important to protect consumers and the food we eat, that these are also taken to our trading partners. So there's nothing in the agreements that would lower that standards that we decide for us. But it also means that when we adopt our standards and ambitions in a way that shall apply for the single market, we have, of course, to respect the strictures and the expectations of the international trading system, meaning They have to be solidly justified with impact assessment and solid science to feed into that risk assessment that then justifies these provisions. Now that's underpinned, I understand, by multilateral work in the relevant standard setting bodies, where we try to foster these ideas and promote them, notably in the Codex Alimentarius, in the IPPC, and in the OIE. So that's important multilateral work. But as long as we don't have international standards as we do have on the labor side or on the environmental side, certainly the approach will have to be a slightly different one, and the justification and making things resist the WTO challenge is a different one, and the form of engagement is a different one with our trading partners than in trade and sustainable development chapters proper. I find the beauty of your study in looking at these two different elements as they both contribute to sustainability goals. But I think still there's value in seeing that in the terms of the technical mechanic of how we can pursue our objectives, there are differences, and differences are important to be very conscious of, because they inform us of how we can go about pursuing our objectives. I think I can leave it at this for the time being.
Thank you very much. Final, maybe quick follow-up, Mr. Weigel, any perspective on the US election?
Well, we're great multilateralists, and so we would find that the World Trade Organization is very important to pursue our ambitions. You will have heard my Executive Vice President saying at his hearing, he will take fresh initiative at injecting green elements into the World Trade Organization. It's one of the ways in which we can contribute to the Green Deal, the overarching ambition of the European Commission and in particular this college. So that is one example. One other example would be what we have read about in the press of the Biden administration moving back into the Paris Agreement. I mean, in terms of commitments and adherence to multilateral arrangements, supporting what the EU is fighting for and standing for could make that conversation easier.
Thank you very much for this, these first initial comments. Now we are entering into the final part of this webinar, which is a 15-minute segment of Q&A and discussion. I would like to start this off. We have a lot of participants that asked very good questions. I will go into these in a bit, but I would like to start this Q&A session off and this discussion session off by allowing the speakers to first react to each other. Does any of the panelists have a direct comment to anything that was said? Is there anything you have on your mind and would like to point out right now before we go into the Q&A from questions of the participants? If not, then I would like to start off with a first question that we received. We received quite a lot, actually. So the first one would be, and I think it's good to bring this topic in as well into this webinar. How do you evaluate the new political objective of resilience pushed now by Corona and its relation to sustainability? Currently, a list of countries requested via the WTO, the EU, to suspend lowering of MRLs as they fear negative competition effects. So the question would be, how do you see in this debate the new political objective of resilience pushed now by the current Corona pandemic and situation in its relation to sustainability? Any thoughts on Corona in this context and resilience?
Maybe I'll kick off in terms of saying something. I don't think that there's any contradiction between the two things. I think to a certain extent, resilience is already part of sustainability. I mean, sustainability, as Mladen said at the beginning, I mean, we have to look at it in terms of its environmental, economic, and social. We have to look at through all those three elements. But I think that resilience is also, it's kind of, if those are the parts of the rock, then resilience is also written through it. I'm thinking of a stick of rock. I think resilience is already part of that. On the comments about, sorry, I'm just trying to lift the question out again to take it. About asking to suspend the lowering of the MRLs as they fear negative competition effects. Yes, well, obviously we have a situation within the EU where there is a political desire to reduce MRLs in certain circumstances. Those decisions are usually based on, well, are always based on sound scientific advice that we get from EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency. Of course, politics can sometimes play as part of the process, but we need to be able to justify those changes in relation to what the SPS agreement says. So I don't think in any way we're shying away from our international responsibilities. We have explained why we think they are justified and why we think they're compatible with the SPS agreement. It's true that the politics here are maybe slightly different than they are in other parts of the world, but that's something that we have to deal with and still comply with our WTO obligations at the same time.
Any further comments? Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Weigel. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's a very important and a very timely question of how COVID-19 affects our ambitions, and maybe two sides, two angles to that, or maybe two concerns. I mean, we have that EU debate about the resilience of our supply chains, and I think one first question would be: did we see any concerns about, did we see any weaknesses in those supply chains as we operated throughout the crisis? That's number one. Number two would then be, what are the right prescriptions for a way forward? And I think if we think of how we define autonomy, we also always talk about open strategic autonomy, and that's for a purpose, because part of resilience is diversification, not depending on one source or one region in the world. And so openness and trade is certainly a key contribution to that resilience that we try to achieve. Thirdly, when looking around the world and looking at what we want to achieve, and that's more on the currently on the labor side, but certainly might be visible also on the environmental side, COVID-19 is putting stress on many countries and jurisdictions around the world. It's depleting their coffers in efforts to support their working population, their companies, and keeping the sustainability topics high on the agenda, high in the conversation, keeping the commitment to seek improvements is certainly an important conversation to be had to achieve what we try to achieve for ourselves, that as we return and come out of this crisis, we return and come out to a better place.
Any perspective from the business side? Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Jakovic. Please unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Certainly, this pandemic, COVID-19, shows us how food supply and food chain is very important for each country. On the start of pandemic in March, when some countries start to close the border, how the trade agreement, trade negotiation, and goodwill from EU country is when it starts to close the border. It was showing two different perspectives. One perspective is that each country have to be at least 60 or 70% sustainable. Second is trade agreement and trade goodwill. I show like trade goodwill when some country close the border, when you don't have some friend from next neighbor country, then trade agreement was not even spoke with each other. For example, Croatia and Austria in some, or Croatia and Italy stop trading in some moment. After a while, 1 week or 2 weeks, everything else will start again, and it will good. But on the start, this sustainable chain is what was very, very important.
Thank you. Any reaction from the other speakers, or otherwise we will move to the next question? All right. Next question would be also, given the multilateral angle that we discussed already, it's a short one because we do not have very much time left. What role could the WTO Green Goods deal have, and does the Commission want to relaunch the negotiations?
So that's squarely a question that a trader would guess. Now, the environmental goods deal that we used to negotiate in Geneva did not have such a favorable fate in the end. The initiative now is to see how we can re-inject green elements into the negotiations of the World Trade Organization. It should certainly have to have a different name. It certainly will have to look at goods and services. There may be other aspects to that, how to better integrate the climate ambitions into the world trading system. But this is pretty early stages as we just start those reflections. So bear with me if I cannot roll out to you a detailed plan of what it would be that should be going there. I should add, however, that I think we're pretty conscious that there is a need for trade policy to overall and more generally beyond the multilateral contribute to Green Deal and climate objectives in particular. Part of that is that we have the Paris Agreement referenced from the early beginning on in our TSD chapters. With increasing prominence in our latest chapters, we make then Paris an essential element that in an extreme situation would allow us to suspend the agreement. Just underline the importance. Now, the big question that we have in front of us is how you would make that operational in day-to-day operation with your partners. And I think there is important fact-finding work ongoing now, maybe an example, not exactly from climate change, but for biodiversity, where we're creating an observatory to give us the data and the elements to identify and to measure change that we aim for and progress that we are making. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but we have the tools and the elements in our hands to take the conversation to a more operational level. And I think when we now work on the trade policy review and when we further onwards work on the new priorities for trade and sustainable development in trade agreements, these will be key questions that we will have with us.
Thank you very much. I invite all the other two speakers to react if they want, maybe perspective from the business side. Mr. Jakubovic, would you like to react? Or, all right. Ms. Bury, any comments? All right, thank you very much. Then we can go to the final question, which is, should foreign products which do not comply with EU standards, for example, on animal welfare, be allowed to enter the EU market in the future?
Well, this is a very good question, especially for the products we have enough in EU. It's not a problem for the products what we not enough have in European country, but for some what we have enough, the standard, the dimension of Copa and Cogeca is the standard will be the same. It's not good for trade, it's not good for business, for EU farmers, that we have import the products from a third country that is lower quality and lower standards than in EU. Normally is that these products is cheaper, and normally that these products have easy to get to the consumer. So for business and for EU farmers, it's not good.
Any final comments from another side?
I think if I could, I just add that we, of course, would like to make sure that animal welfare standards are raised across the board. As I mentioned already, it's one of the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy. But at the end of the day, I think that this is something that has to be negotiated. I don't think that we don't want to impose the targets on other countries. We're not in the business of going around and imposing our standards. As always said, we are multilateralists at the end of the day. So I think these are issues which have to be negotiated, and it depends on the balance in a given trade agreement what happens.
Do you have any final comments? Anyone?
I think from Claire said it all, so there's nothing to add from my side.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Then we have exactly the end of the webinar on the minute. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I thank very much all the panelists for their contributions, also for the comments made on the ECIPE study that is available on our website, of course. And I think we discussed very important topics. Of course, the future of trade policy review, interaction between standards on the domestic level and trade policy. Also, US election, some comments were made, COVID-19 impact, and a lot on general political discussion as well. I think it was a very fruitful discussion. I hope it was insightful for our many participants that we had. Thank you very much to the experts for their time. And this would be the end of the webinar. And I hope to see you soon at the next discussion at ECIPE. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.